but they are happening all the time. So that's we need to be very, very wary of. I mean, this happens at the political level because whether this was in Indonesia with the army in logging or banking in Bangladesh in army, it had been decided by the cabinet in the government. So basically it's a political level institution. Scale. In terms of scale, we have two types of corruption: grand corruption, huge, big money that's involved, and the grand corruption, ordinary people would not often see. They would not feel it. It will not hit them straight away. But it ultimately affects your economy in the sense that it certainly takes away the resources out of the economy into something else. And the other thing is, when a country is known for its grand corruption, you also do not get investments coming into that country. So it affects your economy as a whole in the long run. And it affects also in another very interesting way. For example, there's one country which, according to a recent study, missed out 2 percentage point of GDP growth over a period of 10 years due to corruption. In real term, what that means? In real term, that means that particular country missed the opportunity to lift 30 to 40 million people out of poverty in that period. So that's the kind of effect or impact you can have with grand corruption. You don't see it, but they affect you in a very permanent way. Petty corruption involves smaller sums, usually at the lower level. And this is also the types of corruption that affects the poor and the disadvantaged groups more directly. Because they want to go to the hospital, get a treatment, they pay somebody, then gets the treatment. They want to get medicine, which is supposed to be given free to them, but nothing is free, they still have to pay. So the poor bears the cost. In the same area, the rich and the powerful in the village, they don't pay, whereas the poor who pays. So there is a discrimination in terms of how resources are delivered to you, and the corruption deepens the discrimination. And the premium is put on the poor. So it's also a human rights issue. Basically, corruption takes away your basic right to access resources, access delivery services. Now, let me now talk a little bit about what do we mean by governance. I mean, we all say a lot of things about governance, but really, we need to have a very clear picture of what governance is all about. At a very simplistic level, what governance means basically, governance is about institutions and processes that contribute to decision making. That's governance. So whether you do that within the company, or whether you do it in a government, or wherever, the governance is about decision making. So who decides how the decision is taken, what decision is made, has an impact on you, on the society, on the economy, on your politics, everything. So that's why when you are talking about governance, you really have to think about what are the processes involved in the governance. Is it given by 1 or 2 people sitting up there somewhere in Canberra? Or does it involve the whole lot of people? Is it participatory? If it is not participatory, how does it happen? And in what way decisions are impacting us? Is there a way of knowing, giving a feedback, changing, adjusting? So the governance is about decision making. Now, UN, of course, has come up with a framework of good governance, which involves the following: full protection of all rights. And this is, again, you have to define what rights are. All rights, and human rights, including minority rights. That's what it is. Because in a democracy, the minority is the most disadvantaged. They do not have the elected representative in the parliament. They do not have representation in any part of the government, and their interests are likely to be marginalized consistently. So it's very important that in your governance framework, you have to have certain provision to protect the interests of the minority. Then inclusive governance processes also should allow citizen participation. An elected body or a parliament does not exhaust citizen participation. The parliament certainly broadens the element of citizen participation, but that is not sufficient. The citizens need to continuously participate to assist the parliamentarians to make decisions that are responsive to citizens' needs. And for example, recently the UN undertook a study all over the world involving about 1.5 million people. And they asked these people a very simple question. Do you believe that what your government does in terms of policies, etc., are exactly the ones that you expected them to do? And about resounding 85% said no. And majority of the no answers came from Europe and America, from the democracies. So there's a huge gap between what you expect your government to do and what they actually do. So that is why there is a need that even after election in the legislature, you have to have mechanisms where citizens can continue to participate. And often you don't have this. So UN believes that that kind of structure process is very important to create an environment of good governance. Then freedom of media and right of access to information. Freedom of expression. These are all very important things. But I know of many democracies where, it is a democracy. They have regular elections and everything. But the moment there is some opposing views coming from somebody, you find rather unpalatable response to that. And I know a particular friend from a particular country, and I asked him one day, hey, listen, you guys claim that you are a democratic country, but how come you guys don't have freedom of expression? Because the way I see the way things are happening. He said, no, you're absolutely wrong. We are very democratic, and look, our constitution, we have freedom of expression. However, what we don't have is freedom after expression. So that can be a problem. So when you say freedom of media, right of access to information, freedom of expression of interest, you have to be able to be protected even after you have said something which does not quite please the government. That's the important part. Now, the left-hand side basically gives you the overall parameters of good governance. The right-hand side, it gives you the structure of the public governance, how the public governance should be organized. Again, it has two sides. One is the civic political component, which relates to issues of election, multi-party election, democracy, rule of law, independent judiciary, etc., and all that, political rights, and then civil liberties. You see, you may have political rights, such as participation in election, elected government, but you may not have civil liberty at the same time. So what we find quite often, what is happening around the world, is the rise of what we call illiberal democracy. They are not liberal democracy in the sense that your democracy should be guided by rule of law, and often that does not happen. And the result has been, and this gentleman, Mr. Fareed Zakaria, in his book, The Future of Freedom, has made a very interesting statement after studying about 80 newly democratic countries. And seeing the way these democratic countries behave, and seeing the way these countries are so corruption-ridden, his observation has been that in the name of democracy, what these countries have, in the absence of rule of law, is nothing but rotating, plundering governments. So what happens is you elect a batch of people, they come, they rotate, plunder, then another group comes, they do exactly the same. Because your rule of law is not there, it's missing. So that's what happens. So political rights is not sufficient. You also need civil rights, civil liberties, and other institutions of liberties. On the right-hand side, what I call the development management component. And this involves something internal to the system. Planning, budgeting, monitoring, accounting. How well are they organized? And again, all of these on the right-hand side, development management will not happen sufficiently well if you do not have political rights or civil liberties at all. Okay, so one is related to the other. Many developed country corruption, I believe, and a little bit of very superficial study of the Queensland corruption. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about it. Like, how is it that a country like Australia, and here in Queensland, which is known for its corruption, happens? Because it's got political rights, it's got civil liberties, press is free, media is free, anybody can report on anything. It's simply because I believe that the planning, budgeting, monitoring, accounting part side of it is not standardized. So sort of develop a project by consultation with somebody and offer a job, and you can do it. But if you had done something against the standards, against feasibility studies, etc., then that kind of problem probably not come. And the media often, they don't know of these things until it has come out on the ground. So the weakness in the development management component can also contribute to corruption. So let's look at the framework that I would like to use, and then share with you some examples from around the world. Basically, governance enablers are political rights, multi-party elections, free and fair elections, free and efficient parliamentary process, etc. Elections can be free, but they may not be fair. And there is a very, very subtle distinction between the two. For example, maybe you will find that just before the election, there has been a propaganda made around the media, and media is often controlled these days, against a particular individual or a party, and that completely can change the mind of the people. And that happens quite often. So there's a corruption in various ways. So although the election itself will be very free, nobody is going to intimidate you, but your attitude, your approach has already changed because of certain media propaganda. So it may not be fair. So we have to be very careful whether we actually have free and fair and efficient parliamentary process. Many countries we know they have a parliament, but when you hear what they talk about in the parliament, you would rather not even think about it. Because if the parliament do not deliberate properly and insightfully on issues, then you will never get a proper decision coming out of those institutions. So you have to have an efficient parliament, you have to have a free and fair election. Civil liberty, this is absolutely crucial. Independent and competent judiciary is very important. Independence is not sufficient, you have to have a competent judiciary. You have to have good qualified lawyers working in the system. Free media, obviously, is very important. Again, media is getting increasingly corporatized than what is the case a few years ago. And there's a problem, because once it gets corporatized, then the interests of the corporations become the prime interest and the other interests of the society. So how do you make it free? And the other thing also, the media these days is so much market-based. There is more up there to satisfy the clients with entertainment news and other kinds of rather than serious news of corruption and fraud and embezzlement and governance, etc. They don't have interest. Then you need to have active civil society and rule of law. Again, from the development management side, you need to have efficient audit system for corruption control, and then ethical education. I think it's quite important how actually a good ethical background training can change your mindset, an attitude about corruption, and you have to know exactly how it happens. Now, with that framework, let us see how some of these actually impact on corruption from around the world. According to the Transparency International report of 2009, corruption level has not undergone much change during the last 1 decade. So it's all these talks about corruption, governance, etc., but corruption is exactly the same. And then, worldwide, citizens have reported that political parties, the legislatures, and the civil servants are the most corrupt. And in fact, there was a recent trust survey which showed that almost 65 to 70% of the people of the world do not trust their governments anymore. And that's one of the reasons being corruption. Then, looking at corruption from the supply side, the people who actually corrupt the government, this is what has come up in different parts of the world. In Africa and the Middle East, they say that Dutch and the Japanese are the least corrupted, whereas Indians and to some extent South African companies are the most corrupted. So you can see some kind of interesting mix there. Then in Asia Pacific, they say the Germans and Canadians are the least corrupt, the Chinese are the worst. In Europe, Central Asia, and the United States, most European companies, except Italians, I'm no surprise, are the least, and Chinese companies are the worst. And finally, in Latin America, German companies are least, and again, Chinese are the worst. Now, these have implications with these findings, and I'm coming to it later. And the recent financial crisis reveals corporate corruption caused by deregulation, an outcome of corporate lobby in public policy. You see, the reason the corporations were able to, financial institutions were able to indulge in corruption and manipulation of the clients is because Until recently, they were strictly regulated from the government. But there's